At first they thought it was just a black piece of debris caught against the tree. The river was moving too fast for anyone to think clearly. It had been raining in the highlands for 4 straight days, and by the time the water reached this part of the forest in the eastern Congo basin, it carried everything with it: uprooted shrubs, broken timber, the bloated husks of termite mounds. The color of the water was the color of old rust. It didn't look like water anymore. It looked like something that had swallowed the land whole and was still hungry. Daniel Masudi had been working with the Wildlife Response Unit for 11 years. He had seen floods before, not like this one. He and 2 colleagues, a field medic named Grace and a veteran tracker named Remy, had been called out that morning after a ranger reported movement near the southern tree line. Probably displaced monkeys, the call said. Maybe a small antelope caught against debris. They came with ropes, a first aid kit, and a folding stretcher they almost left behind. They didn't leave it behind. When Daniel first spotted the shape in the water, he said nothing. He raised his hand and the others stopped walking. The shape was small and dark, pressed against a half-submerged tree maybe 40 feet from the bank. The current pushed against it, and the shape held, just barely. Then it moved. A tiny hand tightened around the bark. The fingers were unmistakable, long, dark, curled with effort. Not a branch, not debris. Remy said it quietly, almost to himself. That's not debris. That's a baby. None of them moved for a full 3 seconds. The cub, because that's what it was, a baby gorilla, no more than a year old, was soaked through to the skin. Its fur was matted flat against its body, and from this distance Daniel could see the small chest heaving in quick, shallow pulls. It was breathing. It was holding on. But its grip was weakening. Every time a surge of current slammed into the trunk, the cub dropped 1 inch, 2 inches before tightening again. Its arms were shaking with the effort. This was not an animal that had been in the water for minutes. This was an animal that had been holding on for a very long time. Daniel scanned the bank in both directions. No sign of how it had gotten there. The nearest section of forest was on the far side of the river. A good 60 feet of fast, dark, churning water. The cub couldn't have swum that. It couldn't have walked. The only answer was that the flood itself had put it here, swept it downstream and deposited it against that tree, the way the water deposited everything else it didn't want anymore. The question that hit Daniel, the one he didn't say out loud, was where its mother was. He didn't ask it. There wasn't time. Grace had already begun uncoiling one of the ropes. Remy pulled a long bamboo pole from a thicket at the bank's edge, the kind the local fishermen used. The plan formed without anyone having to explain it. Stay on the bank, don't enter the current, extend the pole, coax the cub close enough to loop the rope and guide it toward shore. Clean, careful, fast. It didn't work. The moment Remy pushed the pole toward the tree, the cub flinched and scrambled upward, its small arms clawing for higher bark. It made a sound, a sharp broken bark of pure fear, and pressed itself as flat against the tree as it could get. It wasn't reaching for the pole, it was retreating from it. The cub was alive and it was aware enough to be terrified, but it was too frightened to understand that the pole was meant to help it. They pulled the pole back. The cub stayed pressed against the bark, trembling. Daniel crouched at the water's edge and watched. His mind was running through options, discarding them. The current made a direct entry into the river almost impossible. Even at the shallow edge it would pull a grown man sideways in seconds, and anything deeper was out of the question. The cub couldn't be scared into the water either. Any additional panic and it might simply let go. And then they heard it. From across the river, from somewhere deep inside the tree line on the far bank, a sound, low, carrying, not loud but shaped, the kind of vocalization that wasn't random. A call, one call. Daniel's head came up. The cub lifted its head for the first time since he'd spotted it. It turned toward the sound with its entire small body, twisting its grip on the bark, looking across the brown water at the far shore. For one moment it stopped shaking. Just for a moment. Daniel looked at Remy. Remy looked back. Neither one spoke. Grace had binoculars up and was scanning the far bank. She moved left, right, then she lowered them slowly. Nothing, she said. Just broken brush. And tracks. Big ones. Going into the forest. Something had happened before the flood separated this cub from its group. The tracks led away, not toward the water. Whatever it was, it hadn't ended well, or it had ended quickly. This was not just a baby gorilla caught in a flood. This was an animal that had already lost something before the water even rose. Daniel filed that thought away. It sat in the back of his mind like a stone. He stood up, took the rope from Grace, and started looking for something he could anchor it to. And then the tree cracked. Not the whole tree. Not yet. A sound like a rifle shot from somewhere near the roots. Underwater, where the flood had been pulling and pulling for hours at the fibrous base. The trunk shuddered. The cub felt it and screamed, a high rasping sound, and in the same instant lost its grip with its right hand. Its whole body swung sideways into the current, suspended for one terrible second by only its left arm and the bark grooves its fingers had dug into. Daniel was already moving. He had the rope in his hand and he was lunging forward along the bank, closing the distance, looking for an angle, looking for anything. Remy was shouting something behind him. Grace was pulling the bamboo pole back up. Daniel reached the closest point of the bank to the tree. He drew back the rope, and beneath the water the roots groaned again. The tree was going to fall. Not in an hour, not in 20 minutes. Soon the tree did not fall in that moment, but it leaned, maybe 3 inches, maybe 4, enough that the angle of the trunk shifted and the cub, still hanging by one arm, swung with it and slammed its small body back against the bark. It grabbed on again with both hands, instinct, pure and desperate, and pressed its face into the wood and held. Daniel stopped at the water's edge. His boots were already in the current up to his ankles, and he could feel the pull of it even there in the shallows, tugging at him with a patience that felt almost deliberate. He stepped back, not because he wanted to, because the water told him, clearly, that one wrong step and he would become the second problem instead of the solution. He turned to Remy, safety line. Now. Remy didn't argue. He pulled the second rope from the pack and looped it twice around the base of a thick riverside acacia, testing the knot with his full body weight before tying the other end around Daniel's waist. Grace was already repositioning, moving downstream to a slight bend in the bank where the water slowed just enough to be readable. She wasn't saying much. She didn't need to. Her job now was to watch the cub and tell Daniel what he couldn't see from his angle. The plan had changed. There was no more time for a clean, cautious approach from dry land. Daniel was going in. Not deep, not into the main channel, but far enough to close the distance, far enough to matter. He moved into the water slowly, one step at a time, keeping his weight low and his feet wide. The current pushed at his shins, then his knees. The cold was immediate and serious. The kind of cold that doesn't wait to bother you, it just takes hold. He felt the riverbed shift underfoot, soft mud giving way to loose stone, and then soft mud again. Nothing reliable, nothing he could trust to hold. He stopped when the water reached mid-thigh. Any deeper and the rope would become a liability instead of a lifeline, yanking him sideways if he lost footing. Maybe 18 inches from crown to base, folded tight against the tree trunk in that posture young gorillas use when the world becomes too large and too loud. Head down, arms locked, everything tucked inward. Its eyes were open and they were dark, and they were fixed on Daniel with an expression that wasn't anger and wasn't trust. It was the look of an animal that had run out of options and knew it. Daniel reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a strip of cloth, an old bandana, faded green that he'd carried in that pocket for years out of habit. He tied it loosely to the end of the bamboo pole that Grace had passed down to him along the bank. It wasn't bait. It wasn't a trick. It was just something soft, something that wasn't the hard, frightening geometry of a human hand, something the cub could smell and process before it had to make any decisions. Very slowly, the cloth end drifted in the slight air above the water, maybe 2 feet from the cub's face. The cub didn't move. Daniel held the pole still and waited. 10 seconds, 20. The river pushed against his legs and the rope tugged at his waist, and he stood there and waited. The cub's nose moved, just slightly, nostrils working, pulling in whatever information the cloth was offering, the smell of dry cotton, of human sweat, of something that wasn't the river. Then one small hand released the bark. Just one. The other stayed locked in place, but one hand reached out tentative and trembling and closed around the cloth end of the pole. Not trust. Daniel knew that. A year of experience and 11 years of field work told him exactly what that gesture was. Not trust, not acceptance, just the arithmetic of desperation. The cub was choosing the cloth over the bark because the bark was failing, and the cloth was there. That was all. But it was enough. "I've got contact," Daniel said, keeping his voice low and even. "Don't move. Nobody move." Grace and Remy went still on the bank. Daniel began to draw the pole back, inch by inch, not pulling, never pulling, just creating a gentle, constant invitation. The cub resisted at first, its grip on the bark tightening again as the cloth moved. Then the tree groaned beneath it, that deep underwater groan of loosening roots, and the cub made its choice. It shifted its weight. Both hands came off the bark and closed around the cloth. For one brief moment, Daniel felt the full weight of it through the pole. Light, heartbreakingly light, and then the cub made a sound. Not the sharp bark of earlier, something lower, softer, a sound that went up slightly at the end, like a question. Daniel froze, because something answered it. Not from across the river this time, from behind him. He turned his head slowly, just his head, keeping the pole steady in his hands, and looked back at the near bank, at the tree line, at the shadows between the trunks where the light didn't reach. Something was standing there, large, still, dark against the darker forest. An adult gorilla, not charging, not displaying, just standing at the edge of the trees with both hands at its sides, watching. Its posture was the compressed, deliberate posture of an animal that had made a decision not to act yet. Its eyes moved between Daniel and the cub with a steadiness that was more unsettling than aggression would have been. Aggression Daniel knew how to read. This was something else. This was an animal that was calculating. Daniel did not turn to face it fully. He did not make himself larger or smaller. He kept his body angled sideways, non-threatening, non-submissive, just present, and he kept the pole in his hands and he kept the cub at the end of it, and he breathed. "Adult behind me," he said, barely above a whisper. "Left tree line. Nobody run. Nobody shout." He heard Grace's sharp intake of breath, heard Remiko completely silent. The adult gorilla took one step forward. Just one. It cleared the tree line and stood in the open air of the river bank, and in the gray floodlight, Daniel could see it fully now. A large female, he thought, though the distance made it hard to be certain. No silverback markings. Heavy-shouldered, her face was turned toward the cub with an intensity that needed no translation. The cub saw her, and everything changed. The small body that had been limp with exhaustion suddenly surged with something else entirely. The cub began to struggle, not in panic, but toward something, toward her. Its legs kicked against the current, its arms pulled at the cloth, and it made that sound again, louder now, the same soft question but with urgency behind it. It recognized her. Daniel was certain of it. He kept drawing the pole back, slowly, keeping the movement smooth, keeping the tension in the cloth gentle enough not to frighten the cub, and firm enough to keep it close. The adult moved again. 2 steps this time, bringing her to the very edge of the water. She looked down at the river, and then back at the cub. Her lips pulled back slightly, not a snarl, just the involuntary expression of an animal under extreme stress, processing something it couldn't fully resolve. She looked at Daniel again, held on him for a long moment. Then the tree cracked a second time, louder, final. The trunk lurched sideways, and the cloth snapped taut in Daniel's hands as the cub lost its footing entirely and swung free, out over the water. Nothing beneath it now but the current. Daniel pulled, and the cub slipped completely off into the river. The river took the cub instantly, not violently, not the way Daniel had feared, not a sudden tumbling under the surface. The current simply accepted the small body the way it accepted everything else, pulling it sideways and downstream with a quiet, indifferent efficiency that was somehow worse than violence. The cub's head stayed above water for the first 2 seconds. Its arms were moving. It was fighting. But the river was not fighting back. It was just moving, the way it had been moving for 4 days, the way it would keep moving long after all of them were gone. Daniel pulled the rope, both hands, arms bent, feet planted as wide as the soft riverbed would allow. The cloth was still in the cub's grip. He could feel the weight of it transmitting up through the line, irregular and desperate, the pull of a small body being worked by a current that outweighed it 100-fold. Behind him, Remy had grabbed the safety line with both hands and was leaning back against it, anchoring Daniel to the bank. Grace was in the water up to her knees without anyone telling her to be, her hands on the rope beside Daniel's, adding what she could. The cub went under. 1 second. The rope went briefly slack, not because Daniel had lost it, but because the current had pushed the cub toward him instead of away, a trick of the bend in the river, and for that 1 second the cloth was slack, and the cub was invisible under brown water, and there was no way to know. Gasping, eyes wide, "Pull," Grace said, not a shout, just a word, flat and certain. Daniel pulled. He couldn't rush it. That was the thing that required everything he had, not strength but restraint, a baby gorilla's shoulder joint, its neck, the soft cartilage of its chest. These things could be damaged by a rope pulled too hard, by a rescue that became its own kind of violence. He had seen it happen with other animals. He was not going to let it happen here. So he pulled with pressure, not force, steady, even, relentless pressure, the kind that moved things without breaking them. The cub came toward him in lurches, a foot, then nothing, then another foot, the current pushing sideways, the rope pulling perpendicular to it, the cub somewhere in between, being negotiated over by 2 forces that didn't care about each other at all. Behind Daniel, the adult gorilla had not moved from the water's edge. He couldn't see her. He had no attention to spare for anything except the rope in his hands and the shape in the water. But he could hear her. A low, continuous sound, not quite a vocalization, more like a vibration in the chest, the kind of sound that large animals make when they are holding themselves very still against every instinct that's telling them to move. It was the sound of restraint, of something waiting. The water was at Daniel's hips now. He hadn't noticed stepping deeper. Remy had let out more rope without being asked, reading the situation the way a good field partner does, giving Daniel what he needed a moment before Daniel knew he needed it. The cub's hand broke the surface and caught the rope itself, not the cloth, the rope, and held. Small dark fingers, locked tight. "There," Grace said. "There, there." Daniel shortened his grip and pulled with everything he had left, and the cub came out of the current in one long sliding movement, dragged through the shallows, and Daniel caught it with his forearm pressed under its chest and walked backward out of the water as fast as he could move. He dropped to both knees on the muddy bank and pressed the cub against his chest, one hand supporting its back, and the cub coughed, a deep rattling cough that shook its whole body. Then again, then it pulled in a breath that was the best sound Daniel had heard in years, ragged and desperate and entirely alive. It was shaking the way things shake when they have been cold and terrified for a very long time, and the worst is suddenly, improbably over. Its fingers were still locked around the rope, and it didn't release them. It pressed its face sideways against Daniel's vest, and it shook, and it breathed, and it did not make a sound. Daniel did not move. He looked down at the top of the cub's head, the fine dark hair plastered flat by the river, the small rounded ears, the impossibly delicate curve of its skull, and he held it, and he breathed, and he did not move. Grace had her hand on his shoulder. Remy was coiling rope with hands that weren't quite steady. Nobody said anything for a moment. There was nothing to say that the moment hadn't already said. She had moved to a point maybe 15 feet away along the bank, and she was standing there in the open, not at the tree line anymore. Her posture had changed. The compressed, deliberate stillness of before had softened into something else, still guarded, still watchful, but the rigid forward angle of her shoulders had eased, and her head was lowered slightly, not in submission but in the way of an animal that is looking at something carefully, rather than looking for a threat. She was looking at the cub. The cub was still pressed against Daniel's chest, face turned sideways, breath coming in slow pulls. Its shaking had reduced to a fine tremor. Its eyes were open and unfocused, processing nothing much: the gray sky, the mud, the smell of wet cloth and a human body, the specific shock of having very nearly ceased to exist. Then the adult made a sound, low, rounded, a single syllable that resonated in the chest rather than the throat. The cub's body stiffened. Its head came up, just slightly. The eyes focused. The ears flattened since Daniel had pulled it from the water, moved forward. The adult made the sound again. The cub answered, small, thin, but there, an answer, shaped the same way the call had been shaped, the same frequency, the same soft endpoint. A conversation with 2 words in it, each of them simply, "I'm here." Daniel felt the cub shift its weight, not away from him exactly, toward something, the small body reorienting itself the way a compass needle reorients when the interference is removed and the real north makes itself known. He looked at Grace. She gave him the smallest nod. He lowered the cub to the mud, gently, kept one hand at its back until he was certain it had its balance, then withdrew that hand, and stayed kneeling. The cub stood on the bank, legs uncertain, soaked and trembling, and looked at the adult gorilla. Then it looked back at Daniel. It stayed that way for several seconds. Not frozen, its weight was shifting, its fingers working at the air, but suspended in something that wasn't quite a decision. Daniel had worked with displaced primates before, with animals pulled from crisis situations who didn't know which direction safety lay. He had never seen it look quite like this, like something with 2 answers to the same question. He kept his hands visible and low, and he breathed and he let the cub look. The cub turned back toward the adult. It took 1 step, then another. Its legs were not steady and it stumbled on the uneven mud, caught itself with both hands, pushed upright again, kept moving. Daniel exhaled, and then the adult gorilla stepped forward, not toward the cub, toward Daniel. Daniel did not stand up. He stayed on his knees in the mud, hands open at his sides, and he let the adult gorilla close the distance between them. Behind him he heard Grace take a slow step backward, heard Remy go completely still. The river kept moving, indifferent as ever, carrying the last of the broken timber downstream toward somewhere nobody would look. The adult stopped 4 feet away, close enough that Daniel could hear her breathing, deep, measured pulls of air, the breath of a large animal that was holding itself deliberately calm. She smelled of wet earth and bark, and something older, something that belonged entirely to the forest. Her eyes moved to the cub first, took it in fully, the way a mother checks an injured child before she lets herself feel anything, assessing, cataloging, making certain. The cub had made it to the edge of the tree line and stood there on unsteady legs, watching them both. Then the adult looked at Daniel. He did not look away. He did not look directly into her eyes either. He held his gaze at the middle distance, face neutral, body still. The posture of someone who is neither challenging nor retreating, just present, just accountable. She leaned forward slightly and dropped her nose toward his shoulder and inhaled, one long slow breath, taking in whatever information a human kneeling in river mud on a gray morning had to offer. Then she straightened. She turned back toward the cub and crossed to it in 4 unhurried strides and lowered herself to the ground beside it. Her large hand moved across the cub's back, not a dramatic gesture, not a human gesture, just a slow flat press of the palm, the way gorillas make physical contact to confirm presence. The cub leaned into it and made a sound so small Daniel almost didn't catch it. The adult looked back once, not at Grace, not at Remy, at Daniel. A look that lasted no more than 2 seconds and communicated nothing he could name and everything he somehow understood. Then she turned toward the trees and the cub went with her, tucked close to her side, and the forest took them both. The 3 of them stood on the bank for a long moment without speaking. The rope was still coiled in Remy's hands. The stretcher they had almost left behind was still folded and unused against the acacia tree. The river moved. Grace said quietly, "I wasn't sure she wasn't going to charge you." Daniel didn't answer right away. He was looking at the place where the forest had closed behind them, the wall of green that gave nothing back. She wasn't sure either, he said. In the days that followed, the team traced the flood damage upriver and found the story written in broken branches and churned earth, the place where the group had been sheltering when the water rose too fast, the direction they had scattered, the gap in the terrain where the cub had almost certainly been swept away before anyone could reach it. It had survived the current, found the tree, and held on. That was all. Daniel returned to the riverbank 4 days later, when the water had pulled back and left the ground soft and readable. He walked the edge slowly, not looking for anything in particular. He found them near the southern bend, small prints beside large ones, pressed deep into the drying mud, leading back into the tree line and disappearing. The family had made it through. He stood there for a while in the quiet, looking at the prints, listening to the river running lower and calmer over its stones. Sometimes the wild does not need us to own it. Sometimes it only needs us to notice, before it is too late.